Hi, friends. Welcome back. So, headline: China detains investment bankers, takes passports, and corruption sweep. Wow. I saw this headline. I wanted to make a video about this stuff. What's going on in China? What's happening here in Korea? And basically, if you're in the Chinese financial markets these days or in the financial industry, there's a lot of fear out there. I would certainly be worried as well if they're arresting people, if they're warning you don't leave the country, if they're like saying, give me the contacts of everyone you know, that kind of stuff. Basically, there's a major crackdowns going on. And if you've been following this story, and we've been talking this a lot on the channel, it started with the real estate collapse of Evergrande and other real estate essentially companies, and now it's spreading into the financial industry. Basically, the government is trying to really just crack down and make examples of people, and to trying to get money to people who want it, meaning that people are like, oh, this person cheated me, it's all their fault, right? And you're looking for someone to blame. The problem though becomes is that what if it's the whole system to blame? But obviously you can't really say that. You just say, hey, it's just one individual person. Now we're all good. And how long will it take, and how many people will need the arrest? Ask the Chinese government about that. I'm a little bit cynical when I read these things because I used to work in China, so I just know how this game is played. Essentially, how can I say it? You arrest enough people and you charge enough people until sort of the masses are quelled, and then you go back to business as usual. Though that is the question: will China economy and the financial markets, real estate market, will it go back to business as usual? Essentially, they've been in a bubble for quite a long time. And it's a similar situation in the USA, right? When everything's going up, right? Whenever you put your money in the market or put your money into real estate and it just keeps going up, you're like, oh my God, this is so easy. And then you borrow more money and you throw it in the market, and it's like it compounds and compounds and compounds. But ultimately, right, it just, there's only so much that you can build, and now you're facing population decline. So, for example, in order for real estate to go, I'm just an example, real estate here, stocks is related. But, for example, in the situation of real estate, if I build a property, someone buys it and make a bunch of money, and you keep doing that. But what if there's no more people to buy said property? And for people who are, say, in the US market, and they're like, oh, Chris, why do I need to pay attention to China? I don't care about China. It's nothing to do with my life. Say you have Tesla stock, or say you have Apple stock, for example, and you want to sell your iPhones and you want to sell your Teslas. What if no one in China has money to buy your products, right? So this is how we're all connected. Or what if people in China now have domestic products that they can buy, essentially Chinese brands, where quality is good enough, maybe even better, and comes at a much lower price, right? So this stuff, and then you put this on top of them, talking about just how the sort of the situation is changing. On top of now in China, they don't have trust in their financial markets, so you have a weakening of the consumer, you have a weakening of the financial markets, and now they're going after the bankers and again arresting people. This is actually pretty scary if you're in this industry. And if anyone else, is exposed to this stuff, please let me know. We live here in Busan in the financial district, so to my knowledge, no one's been arrested here in Korea, so we're completely separate. Which is, well, I was like completely separate. I'll just say we are not the same exactly. But what's interesting though is that the article is mentioning, is China going to go to path of Japan, where you get this lost decade essentially? Or they can try to follow Korea. This was literally the headline here. China can avoid Japan's lost decades if it follows Korea's path. I was like, wow, that's pretty interesting. And let me show you guys this. This is fascinating. If you're invested in the Chinese market here, so this was the CSI 300. The peak of this was around 2020, 2021, and basically it's down to 2019 levels. You guys can see the chart right here. It's absolutely insane. Just imagine it that it's 5 years of just decline, and you just essentially lose faith. What's going on here? And there's a lot of things to look at. Let's take a look at this one first. This is the GDP per capita. This is this chart on the left here. And guys, I've lived in all three of these countries. This is Japan, China, South Korea, and Japan, but we just call it Korea here. So, so China is the black line here at the bottom. So this is, again, basically your average people, how is their quality of life and how much more money are they making, etc. So it's been in a steady growth, right? I'm talking about China. That's the black line there. The one that's really the standout, and this is sort of why I'll talk about life here in Korea, is where I am right now. It's just been up and up and up and up and up. You guys can see this right here. That's the blue line. You look at Japan here, and it's essentially flat from 1990. Yes, there's been some up and downs. You can see it there, but we're basically back to where I'm talking about Japan. back to the 91 levels. This chart right here tells you the story, right? You can see it. So it's not that they're not growing in China, but they're not getting like crazy exponential growth. Now, what's another interesting thing is if you look at the chart on the right. So this is where you are having transformations in various countries, right? And it depends, and sort of getting the Korea situation compared to China. It depends like what you're looking at. So here, non-agricultural labor force, right? So where do you get to the point to where everyone's essentially working in an office and few people are, say, working in factories, no one's a farmer anymore, right? When you're transforming your economy, like things really change. So in China, you can see from 91, this is where we're comparing it, the amount of people who are, again, non-agricultural, so you're not farmers, the percentage has gone up considerably, right? So in 91, in China, it was like percentage-wise, in the 40% range. You can see this, or you could probably say 30% really if you look at closely at the chart. And then now you're like, what is this? We'll say mid-70s, something like that. So you got a whole bunch of people now that are no longer farmers, and that's been steadily increasing. Whereas you compare something like Japan, it's been flat, right? So there hasn't been that sort of change in terms of like how people think of themselves economically. You can see it right there. Korea's gone up a bit, but again, we're also kind of flat. So we're no longer in the sort of developing world, just not. Korea's not a developing country anymore. They were at a time, but now we're flat. Will China keep developing? That is a question, because one of the issues that is really interesting is that actually the Chinese worker costs more now than, say, the Vietnam or the India worker. And so that's why people have been talking about, or say, for example, workers in Africa. That's why there's been talk that maybe this is where there's be fears in, say, the Chinese job market, to where jobs may move to other places where you essentially find cheaper workers. That's what it is. And then the other issue would be, is are companies willing to invest in building up the infrastructures in said countries, right? So China could invest in India, they could invest in Vietnam. They have invested in various countries in Africa, and I can't speak to like every single country in Africa because that's a whole continent, right? But I'm just saying there are other places that people could go. And then the other issue as well is like when you talk about the straining U.S.-China relations, will U.S. money also start going to other places other than China? So these sort of charts right here really tell the story of sort of like, how can I say, just changes that have happened and then changes that can no longer happen anymore. One of the things that's interesting though is when you get into sort of, I'll call it, I was thinking the late stage capitalism, then you start to really have changes in like cultures overall. So I'll give you an example here. This was something that we did recently. Where is it? Right here, yeah, on our vlog channel. And this is just the last 2 videos. We do this for fun, and if you want to see our lives here in Korea, you can watch this on our vlog. But we went to a baseball game a couple weeks ago, and then a few days after that, we went to a traditional market. And it's funny because it sort of shows where we are, and kind of maybe that's where China's going also. So the baseball game basically say, hey, this is like totally, late capitalism, modernity. We're out hanging out, playing sports. We're not worried about, quality of life. We're enjoying ourselves, etc. Right? Do you see what I'm saying here? We're not like a developing country anymore. Whereas you say, look at our traditional markets, that sort of represents an older Korea. And when you go there, and actually I really like going to the traditional markets. It's fun. You get really fresh food, etc. And it's just a different feel to it, right? I don't necessarily want to go to skyscrapers all of the time, right? Sometimes I want to go to places that are locally owned, mom and pops kind of stores, and just it's a different feel to it. And the sad thing about it though is that all the workers there are older, right? And the question is, can you convince your kids to take up the family business and just be a local market kind of person? Chances are no. It's not going to pay that much. You'd rather work in an office. You want to go work on essentially the Korean equivalent of Wall Street, or say for example you're in China, you work in the Chinese equivalent of Wall Street, right? You want to work in the financial markets. And this is where you get into like you're dealing with now first world problems. Now you got this issues of like, is the central bank going to cut rates, raise rates? Like your conversations, your life is all changed. And so that you get into like corruption and these kind of things. And I'm bringing this stuff up because I how can I say, we're going through an election year, in USA, and it's fascinating to sort of hear what people complain about, that kind of stuff. And it's funny because, when you, and I've always said this so many times on the channel, when you get a passport, visit other places, you'll kind of see like what are possible futures, for a country. In the situation of China, when you know, like I said before, when everything's going up and now we're getting to the point of where we're borrowing a bunch of money to keep things going up forever, and now we're building bubbles. Like you're in this weird mix of, and China's different than say Korea, for example, to where you still have a portion of the population that you could call developing world, and then you have a portion of the population is like clearly, you know, first world, whatever you want to call it, or fully developed, or late stage capitalism, where you get into this, you know, financial market, crypto corruption, or whatever you want to call it, real estate corruption, etc. You know, is this the bottom, right? Is this when you start arresting people? Is this the end of the crisis? I'm going to say no, I don't think so, because I think you have real problem with population crisis, right? Where's the money going to come from? And will sort of our economic power, meaning that we have, and this is China here, we have a large population, we have a group of people that are essentially living in modernity, and then you have another group of people which you can basically, to be fairly frank, exploit. And I know I'm just keeping it real with you guys, that's how it is. You know, can we keep that system going on forever? What ends up happening, and this is where it gets complicated, is as you know, social media expands, as education expands, people want a piece of the, you know, the modernity pie, essentially. Actually, I talk about this stuff in my book, Positive Angle. I talk about a lot of things in this book, but one of the things I actually specifically mentioned was working in China and my experiences there. So if you want to read that, you know, you can check out my book. But because I'm just trying to explain to you guys kind of, I don't know how to explain that. like the world over there, it's really, really different. The other issue too, as well, is like in this kind of situation, you always want to be having good relationships. So it's something that I mentioned so many times on the channel. In every video I say, hey, you want to make sure that you're going to be successful in this world, and it could be any country in the world. You know, I say job connections, etc. In the China situation, it's, you know, make sure you have good job connections and also government connections. Everyone who reaches a certain level of success, you end up joining the party, essentially, or having heavy connections to the party, because you can't get anywhere unless you have sort of approvals of that kind of stuff. The thing that's interesting about China, though, and when you talk about this stuff, is that one thing that helps their development quickly is they have a government who can, you know, mandate whatever policy, and then suddenly everyone does it, right? Because it's a one-party system, right? No one votes. It's like they can do whatever they want, right? So you can make things develop very, very quickly. The thing that holds them back, though, is also the same thing, this sort of one-party system where, you know, you get to a certain point and then you're holding back your industries because people are living in fear. But this is also a major problem. Corruption is very, very real in China. And it's a really long discussion, but I just wanted to give you a primer of this stuff. The other thing too I want to mention, if you're curious, because Korea is in a different situation than something in China. So Korea is much freer than China by leaps and bounds, but it wasn't always like that. And essentially, I'm just pointing out a couple movies. I've mentioned this before on the channel, but I highly recommend it if you're interested in anything about, you know, history here in Asia or in Korea in particular. And it's interesting because you don't have the equivalent kind of movies in China because it hasn't happened, right? You haven't had these sort of revolutions. This one's called 1212 the Day. I think the Korean title is Seoul Spring. But basically, and this gets back to the sort of the U.S. election thing. It's fascinating because, and this is sort of where it depends on your knowledge of world history or other places. Like today, we actually have people who defend Trump. And I laugh about that because, like, if you go back to Korean history, no one's going to be defending the military. I'll say no one. I'll just say few people will be defending military dictatorships or coups or stuff like that. Like, it's just, how can I say? Like, would you want to defend a bunch of gangsters? I'll put it that way. But the way this sort of movie shows is like how when a country, you know, moves past that kind of culture, and how do you remember it? I definitely recommend this movie, and I don't want to ruin any, you know, things about it, but really, really well done. And hopefully China will have some sort of thing like this eventually, and I mean in a positive way. And it was a long history, though. So that movie I just showed you takes place in 1979. This movie here takes place in like 1987, which is, again, 8 years later. This is still just talking about, you know, regular people in Korea fighting for freedom and democracy. And this is a fantastic movie. It's called 1987. And it's interesting because if you want to compare, it's like the U.S. to the China situation. I mention this one all the time. It's called American Factory. And this really illustrates sort of the challenges facing American workers and also challenges facing Chinese workers, because it's related but different, but also connected. I know. I said many things there at one time, but I think when you get to learn things of what's happening from regular people, it changes the way that you think about when we read the news, the headlines. Because, guys, I'll give you an example. When I read something like this, right? So, headline, PwC braced for 6-month ban in China over Evergrande audit, right? So, if you have no exposure to any of the, big consulting / accounting firms, right? You have no friends that work in these things, like, oh, it's just a bunch of accountants, whatever, they get lost their jobs, I don't care. But if you have friends that work in this stuff, you're like, oh, wow, this is actually pretty big. Or, we were just talking about earlier today, it was like 1,800 people at PwC lost their job. And I think it's probably related to this whole thing, this ban. And is there massive corruption going at PwC? Maybe, right? I say maybe because the government, they can pick and choose whatever they want to enforce. I'm sure there's all sort of things going on and irregularities, and it's like whatever they want to go after. Or you can actually look at something like this. China starts criminal probe into Evergrande linked wealth manager, right? And they're looking at, oh, you're doing illegal fundraising, et cetera, right? You can pick out any number of people. Until the Chinese government and the essentially regular person on the street is satisfied that you've gone after, every single corruption, everything like that, or until like people feel more confidence into putting money back into their markets, this thing will stop. But this is where I bring the question to you, like, when will you feel comfortable to put your money back in? Maybe never, right? Who knows? I mean, that stuff's really hard to predict. And this is sort of like this, for example, they always say, oh, when there's blood in the water, when there's blood in the streets, when everything gets scary, that's when you want to invest. But like saying this stuff about, say, something like in China is very different than saying something like when that happens in USA, right? Because you're pretty confident the US is going to come back in terms of markets, et cetera. But it's not a guaranteed thing in something like China, just because of the way the government system is. And that's why I had to kind of give a rundown of different places and how Korea is, say, different in China, where we're more opened up. Another example of something, using the China example here. This is a movie called Shanghai Calling. I've recommended it several times before. It's not the greatest movie ever, but it really captures kind of the experience of Asian American going to China, and just kind of what you expect going in and what ends up being when you get there. I really enjoyed living in China. It's really, really fun. But I was there at a different period, right? So, for example, this was the, you can see the changes in the country. So I was there, I've been there 3 times. So, but we'll just say I was there in the 2000s era. So kind of in this heavy growth area, right? It's kind of in this like circled area here where, everyone's excited. There's construction everywhere. If you're there now and like things are collapsing and people are worried about their jobs or getting arrested, it would be a really, really different era, of course. And, also to just explain kind of like how concerns change, economies change, people change as you get to more, later stage capitalism. I'll give you examples. So here in Korea, these are our headlines that we're facing just the last couple of days. South Korea denies hospital emergency rooms collapsing as army doctors deployed, right? So we're talking about like closing down our ERs. Here's another one. Number of ER doctors drops over 40%. 7 hospitals consider partial shutdown. So what are we talking about here in Korea? I just want to give you guys an example of our problems. Essentially, the government wants to increase the pool supply of doctors. They want to have more medical schools. I think it's like they want to add 2,000 doctors a year or something like that. But it doesn't actually address the problem. So why would doctors be against that? You're like, oh, you're just trying to, water down our pay, et cetera. So that would be, one way to say it. The real issue at hand is there's not enough doctors that want to go into, say, small towns, right? There's no one wants to work there. We actually have a very similar situation in USA. If you're a doctor, right, by definition, you're an educated person, right? Like you're a doctor. Moreover, and this is a problem in USA as well, is some fields pay more than others, right? So for example, here in Korea, you can make a lot more money doing plastic surgery. It's very, very lucrative, right? Compared to other fields. So let's say, for example, you're going to be an ER doctor, and I don't know what the exact pay is, but let's just say it maybe doesn't pay as much, or say you're going to be a baby doctor or something like that, and maybe the business isn't there anymore, right? So, and it doesn't pay, just more likely to go into plastic surgery. And then you start to lose, doctors in needed areas, right? So maybe cancer doctor doesn't, pay as much as plastic surgery doctor, et cetera. And so how can you address said things? the other issue, and I'm just talking about like, and this is a whole string of problems that we have in Korea, where you get to this sort of, again, late stage capitalism. What do you do when you reach modernity? And this is not necessarily a bad thing, but people are more likely to sue you now if the whatever you prescribe or whatever surgery you do, it doesn't quite work out the way that they wanted it to, right? It could be any number of reasons, not necessarily the doctor's fault, but any number of reasons. And then it's like, oh, I just don't want to mess with that anymore. I'm just going to go to this one because I'm not going to get sued. Or the government set the laws on my insurance to where like it doesn't cover or whatever. I'm just giving you guys some examples. It gets to be like stuff to where it's very, very different if you're in a developing country where you're like, we just don't have any doctors at all, right? So we're way past we don't have any doctors at all. We're just like, a lot of doctors want to do something that's worth a lot more money. It's changed. Or the same, that's what I'm trying to explain to you guys, the situation in China. It's like we're at the situation now where we're getting people leveraging money and trading crypto and building buildings just to be part of this bubble, and then trying to sell or package a bunch of like these mortgages together and building new security and stuff. Like, you guess what I'm saying? It's like it's a whole other situation. The one thing I will say about this stuff though is that I think what you're seeing in China, Korea, Japan, being to where essentially you have these low population growth flat, is you're really facing a lot of identity crisis. And it is not an easy fix, right? It's not something the government can just mandate to like, hey, everyone start having kids again. It's really not that simple, because you have this whole generation, the boomer generation, that was everywhere around the world, where like there was just a bunch of kids popping out, right? And then there's going to be this major issue to where people aren't having as much kids as they used to, be it for better or for worse. One of the ways to alleviate that is through immigration. So this is something that Japan has done a very, very poor job of, actually. So there's just tough to immigrate there if you want to. In Korea, we're wrestling that with that now. And I've mentioned this before on the channel. There's actually a lot of immigrant workers here, and it just keeps increasing. It's actually really quite fascinating to see. And then going to say like the U.S. situation, which is really interesting, and it's a really, really complicated issue. But one of the things that's different about, say, the U.S. market, and talking job markets, and say other markets around the world, it depends which country that you compare it to. I can't talk to Australia or UK or Germany. I just don't know. But say, for example, if you move to Silicon Valley, you want to work in tech, you're competing with workers from all over the world, right? You may apply for a job over, say, for example, at Facebook/Meta, and maybe a German person could take that job, or a French person, right? Or someone from China or India or Korea, Japan, etc., right? You're not just competing against other Americans. And then what happens in the USA, you have this group of Americans that, just for the frank, don't have the job skills to compete with that kind of market. Like, they can't take the jobs in Silicon Valley. And then, you're competing at that point, you're competing against, workers from another place that may be younger, work for cheaper, et cetera. It's a really complicated topic. But I want to address these things with you guys because I always want you to try to have a fuller understanding of what's happening in our markets, et cetera. So I know when I make these kind of videos, they're really convoluted, and if none of this stuff makes sense to you, and you don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm still going to make it because I want to try my best to explain and give a fuller picture, and I'll just address this because it's like, we live in a world, if you're watching from the USA, they don't even know that China, Japan, and Korea are different countries. And I'm really mean here, but there's some people out there that don't know these things. I don't know what I can say other than I try my best just to give you a different perspective that you may not necessarily get. So anyway, I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on this stuff. Would you be willing to invest in China? That's the question I pose to you. I'm going to tell you, my wife, and I have many friends in USA also that say never, 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 never. And so I guess the question would be, as they say, when it reaches peak fear, when they start arresting the bankers, I mean, is that the bottom? But it's hard to compare something like what happened in China to say the bottom of the great financial crisis in USA, just for example, because that was the bottom then. That's when you should be buying. But again, it's not necessarily a one-to-one comparison comparing the situation in China and confidence in markets compared to, say, in USA. So that's my thoughts on this. Want to hear your thoughts, and I'll catch you on the next video.